After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Norman Empire conquered and brought many iconic additions to England: the Tower of London, the Domesday Book, the country's first ever king, and so on. The Normans ruled the land for 3 centuries, and among life's rich tapestry, pun intended, there were more than a few quirky and stunning events that occurred during their reign. I'm Jake the Voice Par, and these are 10 facts you probably didn't know about the Norman Empire. During the 100 Years' War in late 1339, Philip IV of France was ready to battle Edward III. When the two armies were preparing themselves, a hare appeared in the field and started charging at the French. They thought this was quite a humorous sight. The Normans heard the commotion and mistaken it for the French's battle cry. Desperately, the court of Hainault promoted 14 of his squires to knight status and prepared for the incoming charge. Except it never happened. A battle was never fought. On that day, the order was known as the Knights of the Hare, respectively, all thanks to a courageous little bunny. Before 1066, about 10 to 30% of people in England were slaves. They were sold like cattle, receiving little food, and were forced to work in awful conditions. Slaves were expendable, meaning killing one of them was not even deemed a crime. In the 12th century, the Normans banned slavery across the country. This did not happen overnight, however. William the Conqueror tried to free as many slaves as possible since their victory. Clergies praised their generosity in writing, though some were weary of the change at first. Attitudes changed over time, and soon enough, slavery was seen as a thing of the past. Before the Normans arrived, Anglo-Saxons could become monks from as young as 7 years old. Anyone who decided to leave was branded a vagabond by the church. The Normans changed this. Anyone who became a monk had to stick around until they were 16 years old. So, if you were a 7-year monk, you would have to stay with the monastery for a minimum of 9 years, much like school. Some decided to devote the rest of their lives there. If you were under 16 years old, you could leave for a price. Bet you wish you could have bribed your teachers in order to legally get out of school. William the Conqueror was a feared and respected monarch. His son, William II, was merely hated. He stole from the church countless times and only elected the most popular candidate for pope when he was on his deathbed. He miraculously recovered afterwards. He was boisterous and sinful, if a wise ruler. William II was chasing game with French knight and best friend Walter Tyrrell in the year 1100, but Tyrrell's aim was clearly a bit off because his arrow pierced the king's lung. Since the king was so despised, no one actually blamed the traumatized Tyrrell for what happened. Some historians suggest it might have been an assassination plot. Monks at the time thought it was divine intervention. Either way, few mourned the loss of their ill-tempered monarch. Various battles and conquests took place in Italy across 2 centuries. During the early 11th century, Italy decided to turn to the Normans for help from the invading Byzantines of Eastern Rome. That turned out to be a bit of an unwise plan, since the Normans thought it would be a great country to invade themselves. This wasn't the only time the Normans pulled a cheeky U-turn, because in 1084, the Norman armies successfully fended off the Germans and liberated the Pope. After this enticing victory, they decided to raid Rome themselves. The Norman diet was pretty boring. The poor predominantly ate bread with vegetables and fish soup, but the rich had much more variety. Nevertheless, there were a few quirky rules regarding food and drink that were exercised. For instance, the church banned the consumption of meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. Most people relied on fish. Ale was available for everyone, even kids. Water was ridden with bacteria in those days, so ale was a staple part of the diet. Younger members of the family drank mild ales. In fact, the French thought Norman ale was on par with their finest wines. Only the rich could afford fine wines and meads sweetened by fruit and honey. Before wooden plates and bowls were invented, it was common practice to eat from bread gone horribly stale. Gross, but practical. There were no hospitals in the Middle Ages. Instead, there was the church and its monasteries. These were of limited use when it came to curing people. For one thing, monasteries were more like boarding houses for the poor and elderly. They were fed, kept warm, and were prayed to. Alas, about 1/10 of people who stayed were actually sick, and according to the rulebook of the Hospital of St. John in Cambridge, we strictly ordain that sick and weak people should be admitted kindly and mercifully, except for pregnant women, lepers, the wounded, cripples, and the insane. Mercifully, contemporary hospitals tend not to rely on this rule, provided one can afford them. The Normans were not experts in the field of medicine. They often relied on prayers, charms, or allowing the king to touch the sick with his holy oil-coated hands, as it was thought it would give him healing properties. The stars were often consulted during these times. Surgery, nail cutting, purging, leaking bad blood from the body. The alignment of the stars and planets would determine when doctors and wise women would conduct these. Not all cures were hopeless. For example, willow trees contained aspirin and made an effective deterrent against headaches. Garlic contained bacteria-killing chemicals and was aptly used on boils. In the end, it was mostly down to trial and error. Gerald Cambrensis of Wales was chock full of amusing anecdotes regarding the lives of Cistercian monks, and this tale is no exception. A traveller, weary from hunting, was invited to a drinking game at a nearby tavern by an abbot, the master of an abbey's group of monks. In those days, before a drink, you would exclaim, "Washil!" or "Health be to you." Others would respond, "Drinchale," which basically means "drink up," as was the tradition. The tipsy monk changed them to the more informal responses "prill" and "rill," and so they drank until dawn. The traveller departed shortly afterwards. To the abbot's surprise, the traveller turned out to be nothing less than King Henry II. The monk was very polite and courteous during their second meeting, but the king responded merely with "prill," just like beforehand. After William the Conqueror died in his bed at Reuton Cathedral, everything went downhill from there. After his body was carried out to Abbey O'Holmes for burial, a man interrupted the proceedings and pointed out that this land belonged to his father and that William I had no right to be buried in that area. This turned out to be true, so he was compensated to look the other way. Following that, a fire broke out, which the undertakers had to quickly extinguish. It was soon discovered that the body was too big for the tomb, and the already rotting corpse decided to chip off. A horrific odor permeated through the room, meaning priests had to rush the funeral and quickly evacuate. Centuries later, William the Conqueror was robbed of his bones. So much for a peaceful eternal rest. Those then are 10 facts you probably didn't know about the Norman Empire. For more top lists just like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out our other top lists. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks for learning.